Hello, everyone who, for some odd reason, finds this video, which probably won't be many of you, but I just got finished watching the majority of a video of someone playing Indika. And as a Christian, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts. I'm not really looking to convince anyone of anything or anything like that. The game is meant, I think, to ask questions, not answer them. And I have thoughts. I think it's the dev meant for it to generate conversation, and so this will be part of it. A few parts of it are kind of unique to the Eastern context that I can't speak to as a Westerner. Like at one point, there's a critique, subtle, not direct, but of people buying icons. Like mentions there's like 4 icons, but it never got popular, and said people just buy 4. Obviously, where I'm at, iconoclasm kind of reigns supreme, and even in the Catholic churches where it didn't, the icons never took the effect like they did in the East. So stuff like that, I just can't speak to. I I think icons are beautiful, and I like them, but I mean, if you're poor, like you shouldn't be spending your money like that. But that's really outside of my ability to comment on. Instead, I kind of picked 5 things that I thought the game was asking or wanting, bringing up, and I just thought I'd share my thoughts as a Christian. Not really looking to convince anyone of anything. Just wanted to share my thoughts. If you're like a non-Christian right now, or I guess like a non-religious Westerner, your media experience right now is pretty good. I gotta say, there's what's that song called? The Notion. That's a bop. That's a good song. Well, at least it's an earworm for me. And now with this game, like you're spoiled. And I could tell you, and as someone who doesn't like contemporary Christian music, and sometimes I feel like I'm in a desert. Although there's good stuff, you just gotta look for it. But I've never done a video before, and I don't really know how to transition into this, so there's no good way. So the first, I guess, most obvious thing I think the game brings up, and these will go from most obvious to least obvious, was the initial conversation of the 2 main characters talking about the nature of freedom, free will. They kind of go back and forth, and the main character, the nun, Indika, mentions that you reason a decision. It's not random. Like true, I guess, free will and that character's understanding would be like a random choice. And when you reason, it's based on past experiences, so it's not, I guess, free in the sense that it's random. So in this understanding where reason, or how we reason based on previous experiences, means that you may not always be free, right? And the point is, like, you're never free, right? I don't like ice cream, so if you offer me an ice cream versus like a chocolate bar, and I like chocolate bars, I'm gonna take the chocolate bar every time, based on my past experiences, knowing I don't like the taste of ice cream. And so in that sense, it's a free. It's you can question whether it's a free choice, and that's, I think, the underlying of this conversation. But for me, I don't see it kind of like that way. The way I'm explaining it, you can see how I see it. Where there are things we reason that are still free choices. Like if I'm trying to choose between 2 paper suppliers for my job, and both of them have comparable numbers or the exact same numbers, then it's a reason choice, but it's free, right? I'm choosing one. You could call that random, but that doesn't mean there's not other stuff to it, and it doesn't mean it's not reasoned. But even then, there are other things that I think are reasoned that you could legitimately go either way on. There's not one clear reasonable choice. You just reason and then you make a choice. Sometimes that's based on faith. Like if you're going to go for a job and you don't really have good reason, you just know that it works out for other people. Is that really a reason choice, or are you just choosing? But you're not random either. So I think there's a middle line, right? Where the choices aren't random, but they're not predetermined. If you run into issues when you say, well, it's just my past experiences and that's the reason I make the decisions I make, because then you're just a really complicated leaf on the wind, right? A leaf has external factors that affect it and it can't do otherwise. If this is the case, then you're just a really fancy version of that, right? If there is no free will, then a stimuli hits you somehow through one of the senses that goes through your head. It's filtered through your past experiences, and that outcome will always come out the same. And then there's just no natural way you could do differently, like a natural disaster or like anything else. And that opens up issues with things like criminal justice and the way we understand the way we live our lives and the way we think. And I just don't think it's a way I live as a human. And so I would require really, really strong argumentation or evidence to convince me otherwise. And I just don't have that. So as a Christian, like, when you ask about, oh, well, I reason based on my experiences, so it's not free. It again, I'm not saying everything's free the way, like, it's a random choice, but I also don't think you're powerless. I guess that's the right way to put it. I don't think you're powerless. And the way this, of course, ties back to God and religion is through things like theodicy, which is a defense of evil. Christians often say evil is a result of our free will. And there are Christians that disagree with that. They'll say, no, God is sovereign over everything, and he did this because that's our purpose. It's not where I would stand, but they definitely exist. And for me, I would say that our free will exists, but it's not like absolute. There's this concept in Christian theology called prevenient grace, which is the grace God pours out on you before you're a Christian. And when he does that, it enables you to make that decision to follow God. So even if you kind of denied every other free choice, the idea of prevenient grace means that you're at least free to make that one choice. And that you couldn't make the choice to follow God without it. So we know that even without the rest of the discussion, God is intervening to at least make the religious choice, the ultimate choice, free, regardless of whether or not things like whether or not I'll have ice cream or a candy bar are free. And I think we know that experientially because of like what I just brought up, where we experience that we're not leaves and that we have legitimate difficulty with choices because we can go one way or the other. It's not just always straight to the end. But the way the characters go with that is, why does God punish us for making the wrong choice? Like, he gave us free will, and then he punishes us for using it? That doesn't make much sense. And it's a really good question. And it's kind of predicated on a certain understanding of hell, which is my second point we'll get to. But, like, God, if God made you to always have the same outcome, then you're not free. You don't, to me, free will is the legitimate ability to do otherwise. Even if one side is stacked, it's just the legitimate ability to do otherwise. And so, in my understanding of free will, that isn't free. And so if God did make us like that, we wouldn't be free. However, over and above that, they say, like, well, if God wanted us to just make the right decisions, he should have just done that. He should have made a path. I also think, though, that thinks that the journey is unimportant to God. That sanctification, that process, isn't part of why we're here, isn't part of why we're made. And I disagree. I think the journey is incredibly important to God. And if it wasn't, then things like, why don't we just kill all the babies so they go to heaven and one person goes to hell, becomes a lot more appealing. When I think, like, the whole point of being born is to live. Life is good, and to deprive that from somebody because of a fear of hell is wrong. And maybe my views on hell influence that. There are a few views of hell. We'll get into the second point now, which, we'll start with the more fundamentalist position. Not fundamentalist, more literalist. I don't like that word either. We'll start with the first position, which is what you hear and what this game represents as like the version of hell. It's the most fifth grade, this is what the Bible says, reading of the text, which is that hell is eternal conscious torment inflicted on God because of his justice, right? Imagine a drunk driver killed a family of 6, and then he goes up to the stand, and his father is a judge, and he says, well, I love you, so you don't get any punishment. It would be an offense to justice. Let's say that family of 6, too, are the only living members of that family. There's no aggrieved party. They're all dead. So, and the father might say, like, well, my son has just completed AA. He has a very low chance of, repeat offending. But it's an offense to justice to do that. And so God, being perfectly just as part of his character, must punish sinners. And that's why Jesus' death is so important in this theological framework, because Jesus' death literally enables God to be just, but to forgive you of your sins, because Jesus took that punishment. And so now there is punishment, that justice is satisfied, but you're off scot-free. And it's not perfect, but that's the idea. And then the conversation usually comes around to, well, but then why is it eternal if the crimes aren't eternal? And usually the pushback to that is, well, the crimes aggrieved an eternal party, and so the crimes are eternal. And they have an eternal nature to them, and therefore the eternal nature of the punishment is just. They say this objection is actually rooted in a misunderstanding of how holy God is and how unholy you are. At least that's my understanding of their understanding. And because of that, the objection is just because you don't understand your own position. However, this is rapidly falling out of favor in most circles. In like evangelicalism, which is more common in the West, at least to be popular, they have very good media. Annihilationism is kind of picking up steam. That's what I was told, which is the view that when you die, if you're not a Christian, you'll go to hell for a time to be punished for your crimes, and then you'll just cease to exist. You'll be destroyed, hence the annihilation in the annihilationism. You'll be annihilated. This comes from a verse where Jesus says that God can destroy in hell and a few others, and they build up an argument, much like the people in the game do about, the injustice of hell if it's eternal. And so you can see why it gains popularity. And now that we're outside of that first position too, these readings of the text read comments about fire and hell as being poetic or non-literal readings of the wrath of God that have ties to like their context, their cultural context, as meaning wrath and not literal hellfire. Basically, like in these contexts, fire often denotes anger or punishment. And so when you read them poetically, you're free from this really, for lack of a better term, draconian reading. And the natural end of that then kind of goes to universalism, which is the belief that you will live forever, regardless of where you end up. However, those in hell will ultimately be saved. This is a really simple theological argument. God wants everyone to be saved. Obviously, he's all-powerful. His will can't be resisted. So he will, in the end, save everyone, eventually. And again, it's simple and it's clean and it solves issues, but it does run up against the text more than some of the other options. For me, and this is where the game kind of, I guess, blindsided me, because I thought this was an Orthodox understanding. The Orthodox are the ones who taught it to me. However, they were Greek Orthodox, and I know the national churches in Orthodoxy are slightly different, so maybe Russian Orthodoxy is different. Maybe their theological education has slipped because of the Soviet Union, of course, cracking down. Maybe he just had a priest that was super influenced by the West. I don't know. But in my understanding of hell, heaven and hell are the same place. And the difference is that a Christian who goes to church, their soul is healed through the sacraments and through participation of the Christian life. And when they get to heaven, the full love of God is revealed to them. And because their souls are healed, they experience it as bliss. Whereas the unregenerate, or those still sick with original sin, will experience this as pain and discomfort. And it'll reveal them to themselves in a way that's extremely painful. That's the wrath of God. It's kind of this revealing of reality. And so to me, hell is where those people will go, fleeing from God. And it'll ultimately be their hatred for God that causes this pain. And if they would cease their hatred, the pain would stop, but they won't. A lot of these debates on hell always for some reason have this underlying understanding that sin stops in hell, and I've never quite understood that. I don't see any reason why you couldn't have salvation after death, but I don't know. I'm not a universalist. I don't think it'll be revealed. At the same time, too, when God describes hell, I think he's talking about more natural effects than actual, I'm going to do this to you. Of course, it's used that wording. A lot of times God doesn't do something and it's worded as him doing something. That's very common in the ancient Near East, I've been told. And I think this is just another one of those cases where this is a natural thing and it's just framed as God doing something. So I think, like the people in hell will be there because of their hatred. And if they would stop, and they'll know this, there's going to be no ignorance, it would stop. And God will love them, but he will also respect their decision. There's a kind of minority, not minority, it's new. There's new theologians arguing that hell is a mercy. Hell is a place God created for those who hate him and reject him to go where he isn't. And that's what they say, hell is just a place where God isn't, which we've never experienced on earth. And so he created it because that was their decision and he wants to respect it. Kind of back to that conversation with the character where she says well, why did God do this if he was going to punish us for our decisions? Well, what if it isn't a punishment? What if that's your decisions are unpleasant? But he's actually doing this because he respects your decision and it just happens to be unpleasant. And he's just trying to warn you. So there's a lot of debate about hell, and a lot of objections to Christianity center around it. And I've always found that a little wrong-headed because to me it feels internal. There's no argument that ultimately ends with Christianity is false, unless you take a position where you can only read the Bible this way. And I get that. It's the simplest, most straightforward reading, but that doesn't mean it's right. It's a 2,000-year-old book. You can't always read Shakespeare on its face. It's not always clear. At least Shakespeare was written in English. That's not a good example, actually, but it's old, different languages. Just because that's a straightforward reading does not mean that's the right understanding. And so those were the thoughts the game got me thinking. And it hurt me when one of the characters says something like, why did God make me like this with free will? If he wanted me to choose the right thing so he would love me, why didn't he make me that way? And it's well, God doesn't. That hurt me because I know people think like that, and God doesn't stop loving you. But Christians can make them feel that way because we make it seem like God has stopped loving them when we're harshly judging them. People feel that way rightly because that's how Christians like me have presented it. And so they're not wrong to feel that way. We're wrong to present it that way. And it's, you have that freedom, and it's never presented. Well, it's not never. Oh my gosh. It's usually not presented in a good way to say hey, we believe this is the best path for you. We believe this is the better life, and you should follow it. And of course, in this game too, there's a criticism of this extreme Christian life, and I think it's fair and unfair. Monasteries are great things for people who really want to do it and who really are passionate about that sort of life. But monasteries are not made for people who are forced there. That's not the point. And a lot of people do feel that way. You're homeless, you're hungry, you have a lot of things. And so you try to go to a monastery. And of course, because of the style of the life, not everyone makes it. But then people do make it, and they're part of it, and they have nowhere else to go. And then suddenly they feel stifled, and they can't leave functionally because they have very few applicable skills, they have no money, and suddenly they feel trapped. And I've always felt that the church should have money for those people, because it's better for everyone if people who don't want to be in a monastery are free to leave. And one of the reasons, because you're always free to leave, but it can feel like you can't, I'd assume. And I just always felt the church should do more, not just for monks, but also for the clergy, that if they want to leave, the church should support that. You don't want people in leadership who don't want to be there. And I get why that can feel stifling, but that critique of monasticism is, in my opinion, a critique of it done poorly and wrongly. Like, again, they're abusive to her, and I know that definitely does happen, but I also have seen quite a few monasteries, and I don't think that's the norm, but it is a travesty it happens at all, so that's fair. Anyway, I find it later in the game funny. They're talking about the soul, and there's this little quip of like, what is the soul? No one ever talks about what it is, and that's because it's not quantified like a scientific thing, right? It's like, I don't know, it'd be like asking, what is philosophy? And when you say, oh, it's an idea, they say, well, that's no, but like physically, what is it? Like, well, it's an idea, it's a thing. And this is way different, right? A soul is a thing, unlike an idea in philosophy. But the point is, it's not quantifiable scientifically. So it's like, what is a soul? A soul is whatever makes a human spiritual, right? What is that? When someone dies and goes to heaven, what carries on without them? We have no way to scientifically quantify that. The Bible gives us some ideas, but like, you're not going to be able to put it under a microscope. And so, of course, if you ask someone, well, what is a soul? They're going to give you vague answers, because it's not it's not like an idea where you can explain it, and it's not like a scientific thing where you can study it. So it's going to be vague, and that's just a kind of discomfort you're going to have to live with when you accept non-scientific materials exist or things. In the end, my understanding of the soul is what makes you and I different from, I don't know, like a dog or a cat or a leaf. What is it about humans that makes them rational, that they can understand, introspect, understand mathematical theory, this sort of reason and this sort of self-understanding? When you think about all the atoms of your body being ripped apart and put back together somewhere else, is there a part of you that's missing there? And I feel like there would be, but there's no way to test that, right? Unless we could actually do it, which would be horrific and ethically questionable. But if you could, and you reassembled the person and they were completely different, that'd be one way. If they're completely the same, that would definitely make it seem like there isn't, but it wouldn't answer it entirely. It's a really tough thing. So again, it was just a question, just like a quip in the game. It wasn't really much of anything. It just kind of got me thinking, like, you're not going to always have really comfortable materialistic explanations for all this stuff. And no one's a Christian because, they believe there's a soul and they work from there. Most people wouldn't be. There are philosophical arguments for like dualism that have been quite persuasive, but most Christians don't work from that way. And yeah, and so these questions kind of lead in the story to then one of the characters, spoiler, getting his arm chopped off, and the game, not, I'm going to say subtly, maybe not so subtly, kind of implies like, well, God doesn't do miracles like that. And it's a good question. Why doesn't God heal amputees? I think it's a whole website. And there is one recorded instance, pretty well recorded, where there was an amputee that had a limb regrown, apparently quite fully. I think it was in Spain. I think it was 16 to 1800s, in that realm. And again, quite documented enough that it's, it seems to have happened. And so you'd say it's rare, right? And so the question is, why doesn't God do it more often then? Which is a different question, but let's say, why doesn't God do it more often? People are going to hate me for saying this. I don't know. It's a mystery. I think modern movements that are trying to get more respect for disabled people have done a lot to convince me that maybe we've seen it wrong. And most disabled people don't actually need healing, but the support of the community. And they actually, by letting the community support them, play an integral role into showing the ethical character of a society. But at the same time, there are a lot of disabled people that suffer. And I don't want my words to sound hollow to them. I know it's tough. And so those, I could say like, oh, well, that suffering will be repaid and it'll be fine at the end. And I do think that those people will ultimately be repaid for their sufferings more than anyone else. But I also think, there's a part of it that's modern medicine sometimes goes too far. I remember a story of a guy who just had like so many surgeries and then he wanted to die because he was just being kept alive. And sometimes we've come so far with medicine, we don't ask whether or not we should, we just ask whether or not we can. And there's, now that we're getting to a point with medical technology, there'll become a point where that discussion might be the time to be had about when treatment goes too far. And I think that's actually starting to come up, and that'll be good, and that will reduce some suffering. And I also think part of the reason is that there's so much suffering with the people like amputees and people born with birth defects is that I think it falls on us. I really feel like the solutions to their suffering are on Earth. If we could work together, if we could put the money that deserves to be put into it, we could find ways to make people perfectly comfortable. I genuinely believe that. And so when people say, like, God, why aren't you healing amputees? I often think maybe we should be looking at ourselves and asking ourselves, why aren't we doing more? Because I think we could and we don't. But again, that's a faith position, much like my other faith positions, of believing there's solutions to this on Earth. And maybe that's just because I believe if there wasn't, maybe I believe God would heal more amputees. But in the end, a lot of these discussions, though, are actually more aimed at certain Bible verses. I think the game actually shows one that's like, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, throw yourself into the river and it'll happen. Now, again, then that goes into like, well, is a prayer efficacious because we ask, or do we ask because the Spirit has moved in us to pray for efficacious things? And then the question becomes like, well, why doesn't God want to heal amputees? And again, that's when you're like, well, they must provide some benefit to society, but ultimately we don't know. And that's just an unsatisfying answer. But in the end, I'm not a Christian because of, I believe God can heal amputees, but it's a tough question. I just think that if society treated amputees and those with birth defects better, and we really showed them their worth and the value they provide and what they're here for, I think questions like this would lose a lot of their weight. And I really think questions like these are best directed at us and not God. We pray for God to heal amputees and not for us to put down our weapons and work together to fix things. And I think that says a lot about us. So the final question this game kind of brought up was related to the thought process of the main character, which kind of showed a certain type of religious thinking that that can bring up the question, like, well, is religious thinking damaged? Oh, I'm so awful, I'm so terrible, I need to be fixed, yada yada yada. And I think that can happen. I've definitely seen people get torn up by obsessing about all their faults. But I think that's just because people have a tendency of going too far. It is fine to seek perfection. I hope we can all agree with that. What's wrong is when you destroy yourselves for failing to attain it. And so there has to be this balance of, I'm seeking God, I did something wrong, and then God forgives you, and you have to let it go. And where people get destroyed in themselves is when they're stuck on a sin and they let it eat themselves. And I heard this in a sermon once where they just don't believe God when they say they're forgiven. And that's what eats them up. Because being caught in habitual sin can be a scary thing. But I also think for those people, when they obsess about it, they actually get themselves even more caught. There's this statistic that, people in more conservative religious states, they consume more questionable materials than others. And I think that's because there's so much shame and they obsess about it so much. If you stop the shame and you stop obsessing, I think you'd be surprised at how much further you'll get. And I also think at some point these people need to kind of give it to God and say, hey, I'm going to do what I need to do and do my best, but you also have to open doors, and then kind of work with that and really accept that the forgiveness of God isn't completely undone by a habit, especially when those habits become ingrained. And now we understand better how those ingrained habits become almost like addictions. So I think hopefully as we better understand the nature of habits, these sorts of things will become a great comfort to those people, because they're definitely distraught. But I'm hopeful in that a lot of these people, their priests and their spiritual leaders, tell them hey, you're being too hard on yourself, and everyone around them tells them this. And so we know that this is, for lack of a better term, disordered. It's not part of the natural order, and therefore everyone is invested in getting these people help. And I really think that there probably are a few that aren't, but the majority, grand majority, really want to help people like this. If your average Christian knew someone like Indika existed, they would want to help them and help change their thoughts. And I would say even the majority, regardless of where their faith ended up at the end, they would want them healthy. It's sad to me that probably there's a decrease there, but people like their in and out groups have evolved for that to be useful. So can't blame Christians for being human that way, but it is frustrating. We're trying to be better, and I understand why that's frustrating. I really liked the way this game made me think. It's very beautiful. It's very well done. I hope we can get a Christian game that's this well done in the future. I know That Dragon Cancer is supposedly like this. I didn't play that game. I don't know. I just never wasn't my cup of tea. Same as this game. I didn't play this game. It wasn't my cup of tea. Same with That Dragon Cancer. Maybe I'm just not ready for a game like that or this, but no, this was. I'm impressed. They did a really good job on this. I hope their next game is maybe a different genre and subject matter, so maybe I can play it and get full enjoyment, but evidently very creative. I'm happy for them that they're out of Russia. They're not drafted. This was an exploration, I think, really of the main developers' journey with his faith, and he expressed it in a really creative way. I read a Guardian, I think it was Guardian article, and so yeah, I know he's not a Christian, and I know he's not anything else. Being in Kazakhstan, there's a chance he became Muslim, but he's not. This article was very recent. So if you're wondering why, well, how do you know that's what he meant by this? I don't. But, I am answering the thoughts brought up from my context, not necessarily what he maybe meant to bring up. The game raises questions. It doesn't provide a lot of answers. And I'm the one who's answering questions that it didn't. I think it's meant to raise conversation, and maybe that's why I'm doing this. I actually have no idea why exactly I'm doing this, but if you're one of the 5 people that maybe ever end up watching this, I appreciate you listening to my thoughts. They were just thoughts, and they're imperfect. I didn't say anything. I didn't research this, and I'm sure I'll be embarrassed when I listen to this back and watch this back. But no, I really liked thinking about this, and games as a medium for tough conversations can be really good, and I'm excited for the future.